Thank you very much, Sally, and thank you for having me. We in the NUJ are delighted we were asked to be here. You'll see from what I've said, should we create another ethical code, that I am going to sort of bring in a small note of skepticism. I suppose in a way it's a bit condescending of us, seeing we have a code ourselves, which I'll talk to you about. I'm bringing that in because, of course, one of the outcomes of this project is about a code and whether you should have one. And I will, is it just, sorry, I should put on my glasses, then I know how to do it. Oh yeah, grand. Oh God.
The other one.
Yeah, right, right. Just for background, the NUJ's had a code of conduct since 1936, possibly the first code of conduct for journalists ever formulated. It was most recently updated in 2011. This happens regularly, and if any of you have ever looked at the code, you will see it differs hugely from that in 1936. The council, which I'm a member, was established in 1985. Its main function is educational. It was, I think, somebody proposing it at the time said it was to take the code to the membership and to make members aware of the code. It does have a disciplinary role. Members can take a complaint about other members, not members of the public. And in the first couple of years of it, there were over 200 complaints, and thank God I wasn't on the council in those days. Now, 2 or 3 a year, and most of them, to be honest, are dealt with in some sort of conciliation. There is what's called an ethics hotline, which a lot of members who've never used it find hilarious. A phone number you can call to get advice about ethical issues. There's about 5 or 6 calls a month. They usually go to the chair. I sort of get a handful of them from members here. I'm obviously hardly at liberty to talk about them, but people do ring and say, look, I've been asked to do this, should I? What are the ethics about this? Should I do this? Is it a breach of the code? And you will be surprised at who does, from what publications or what broadcasters. But I would say that journalists in the main, I think Roisin was saying this, journalists in the main tend to be more concerned about ethics than I think the general public probably is aware. That's the code. I suppose for our benefit, Section 5 or Article 5 is possibly the last bit that remains from the 1936 code. It's sort of like the coccyx of the NUJ's code. It reminds us where we came from. It's about getting information by straightforward means. As far as we're concerned here, the code about ethnicity and which is there somewhere, is probably the most interesting of what for our gathering here today. However, a lot of members of the NUJ do worry about this. They worry about whether a union should actually be policing its members in this way. They worry about whether they should find themselves possibly at the end of a complaint by another member, which their union then takes maybe against them. And they worry whether their union should be fining them or possibly even expelling them. And they wonder whether it's appropriate. I think it's absolutely, utterly appropriate that a trade union for journalists deals with ethics, and that is one of the reasons. Because at the end of the day, a union can bring in that which I think is the most ethical thing, which is collective action, to defend ethical standards. And it is an industrial relations process at the end of the day that journalists can use and have used to defend ethics. So although some of our members have a problem, especially those at the end of a complaint, I wonder whether their union, which they have paid dues to for many years, should be taking action against them. That is the reason, and I think it is quite appropriate that the NUJ has an interest in ethics. And one of the reasons why, when some of our members in the past have wondered whether we should join a general union, especially actually our members in RTE, one of the arguments against that was that general union will not have a code of conduct to relating how journalists should do their work. So there it is. Can I just say it's important to say that the code of conduct is about guidelines. It is not a set of regulations. Journalists have journalists would love regulations. That's why they jump on the defense of sources as nearly a regulation and say, this is it, we've got a rule that we have to abide by. And that's the reason they love it so much. Because to use, I suppose, the ethics of the language of existentialism, journalists in a way are condemned to freedom. There is no one there to tell a journalist how to do it. You have to go by your own ethical stance. And in a sense, when you start looking at journalism ethics and whatever, the people who take it probably most seriously are the American journalists. And the reason they do, I think, is because of the First Amendment, which literally says Congress should pass no laws that will in any way infringe on freedom of the press, which means that they know that there is nothing going to hinder their work through laws. We obviously have more here in terms of Official Secrets Act and in terms of libel, whatever. But in the main, journalists, when they decide to cover a story, are free to cover it whatever way they think, I suppose, will sell at the end of the day. So to be ethical is to understand ethics, is to actually, despite what Peter said, and I fully agree with him, I was that unreflective journalist for 20 years, but at the end of the day, an unreflective profession should be, in a sense, the most reflective, because the lack of regulation, in effect, and the way we go about doing the job should demand that we are reflective. But I just want to, this was a quote I found the other week. Lucy Kellaway, who actually writes a very good column in the FT, and it's in the Irish Times as well. And she was asking people about employers' codes. And she said, the past week I've asked everyone I've met if they've read their employer's code of conduct. The majority said either no or looked sheepish and said they had skimmed it. The reason I put it up there is, of course, that people sort of know there are codes of conduct out there, but probably don't really read them. And if you work in the FT, in fact, the NUJ's code of conduct is part of the code that journalists are meant to read, because we've actually got a strong union in the FT. It was part of my contract with the Irish Times. The NUJ's code of conduct was sitting there as part of that contract. I was meant to read it. I didn't for an awful long time, and then I decided I should, because I was meant to be a union activist, meant to know about these, so I read it. But that's what happens with codes. I'm not that worried about it. And there's the noise. They're some of the codes I could find. Now, what's missing from there is actually a very good one on ageism. I say this is probably part of that issue myself. There is lots of where you see mental health ones. There are lots of individual conditions and associations related to those conditions that have been put up codes as well, Schizophrenia Society or whatever. They're all missing there. So there's a load more, but there you see them covering poverty, covering suicide, covering equality issues, covering race reporting. They're all up there. They're out there. And journalists are told you should be looking at those because people have decided this is the way you should, in effect, do your job. If you're in broadcasting, and of course we're concerned here with broadcasting, these are what I suppose would be the interpretations of the regulation, because of course broadcasters are governed by regulation here and in many countries in a way that press reporters are not. And the whole online thing, which I think is so interesting, is a sort of a netherworld between the two in a way. But here are the various, the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland and RTE, their, in effect, interpretation of the Broadcasting Authority and how it is applied on the ground. Now, if you want to see the difference between guidelines and regulation, have a look at the BBC. The BBC's, if they've changed the name, it used to be called the Producer Guidelines, but in fact, it governs everything from what time in the morning you get up to whether you should have 1 or 2 spoonfuls of sugar in your coffee. I mean, it is so prescriptive, it's unbelievable. But of course, it's the BBC and it's governed by broadcasting legislation as is. So that's what you see. There's 2 different types of codes, and I think it's important that we understand the difference between them, and also the fact that when you all come to putting a code together, remember you are looking at a very crowded marketplace even. This is from the International Federation of Journalists. I think it's the last, but Aidan would be able to tell us this. I think it's the last one, and it's interesting. Can I just say about the IFJ? The IFJ is the International Federation of Journalists. It brings together all journalist unions from around the world. The importance of its code is that many unions in emerging democracies or transitional democracies will just simply take this code and say that's our code of conduct. So it's a really interesting and important code. But if you look at it, it says, within the general law of each country, the journalist shall recognize in professional matters the jurisdiction of colleagues only, to the exclusion of every kind of interference by government or others. Now, what that says is the journalists will only look and take guidance from other journalists. And I know, and I've been that journalist myself, where you say, who the hell are Pavi Point to tell me how to do my job, or whoever it might be. And here it is written in a code that would probably view itself as probably more relevant to maybe Southeastern Europe and Central Asia than to Western Europe, where government and others are trying to influence journalism to a huge extent. But there you see a mindset within journalism, which is the view that journalists' job is to defend freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and don't like anybody who might be interfering in it. And there is no doubt that a regulation and a code with the best will in the world is about limiting that. You're saying there are limits on free press, there are limits on freedom of expression, of which there are. And therefore, the journalists will often say, I'm skeptical about codes. I don't like codes. There are too many of them already. There's a tendency to ignore them and a view that codes are tantamount to censorship and a limit on free speech. I put this up there. I mean, some of you know damn well what this story is about. It was an opinion piece that appeared in the Mail, which was accusing traveller males of being inherently violent, I think the story was. Anyway, it was taken to court, and the Mail won. So therefore, it wasn't just simply a difference of opinion about a piece, it was a victory for free speech. That's how it was viewed by the Daily Mail, and how a lot of journalists probably, although that one I have to admit, probably split journalism quite a bit, but that's how it's viewed. And I want you to understand that, because when you're putting together codes, you've got to understand why some journalists might be wary of what you're doing. And it's not that they are in favor of hate speech. It's not that they are racist. It's because they fear that that there might be a growing diminution of press freedom. So I want to look now at, I suppose in a sense, be more positive. I don't have a problem with codes. I'm actually involved in obviously pushing one code in particular. But I think when you're putting in new codes, you should think of a few things, and one of them is any new code should build on an existing code. I think if you look back at the ones I showed you earlier on, you will see that most of them have been drawn up with the NUJ, so they're based on the NUJ's code. Or you could do similar talk to Peter and say, we want to do this, can you help us draw up a code? And I'm sure Peter's office would be delighted. But to build it up on an existing code, so that it doesn't look like in any way that it is in competition with existing codes, that you actually end up with a whole load of codes out there which are seemingly at loggerheads with each other. Research is needed to see if there is a need for another code. We've all accepted here that there is such a thing as hate speech in this country. You've got to show journalists that it exists in newspapers and magazines, online and in broadcasting, that hate speech exists. And you've got to do the research. Journalists are not only not massively reflective, they are evidence-based. They'll say, we want to combat hate speech. You say, I haven't seen any hate speech. Why are you putting on another code of conduct? Why are you having all this stuff if you can't show me that there is hate speech? So research is needed to show it exists. And if you're saying, which is, I think it's a legitimate thing, to say, no, with this preemptive, we're actually putting in place a code that will deal with the future, because as Ireland changes, we feel it might happen. Well, therefore, that's what you've got to do. You've got to explain why a new code is necessary. There's an education process. I think that just simply having codes of conduct delivered to newsrooms doesn't work. Any union activist will tell you about the codes of conduct from various groups coming into newsrooms, sitting there on one of the desks, collecting dust, and about a year later somebody decides to throw them into a litter bin, partly because a new code has come in. So they get rid of the old one, and then there's something else for some other thing. Address wider issues, which I think Roshi mentioned. Diversity in the newsroom. I think this is a huge, huge issue. Journalism is, at its best, should be reflective somehow of the society in which it operates. And we are clearly not, and clearly probably haven't, for probably 50, 60 years, when journalism tended to be a sort of a working class profession of people who went into what was really an apprenticeship type of scheme. So there is a wider issue of diversity and includes social media, bloggers, etc. Out there are some dreadful bloggers, admittedly, but there are some very good journalists who have blogs, and that's actually how they make a living even. They've got to be included increasingly in what we call journalism. We can't simply say that journalism consists of people who work in newsrooms. It doesn't. It's a lot of other people, and they have got to be brought into the conversation and debates about ethics in a way they haven't up to now. And I think they should be stopped and be called citizen journalists as well, by the way. I think all journalists are citizens, but that's another issue. And I think that's it. Okay, so thank you very much, and I hope to be of some help.